A simple woman dragged from court for wearing a flag pin. What she did next shocked the entire country. They thought she was just a nobody with a pin on her chest. But by the time she stepped back into that courtroom, every head was bowed and every mouth was silent. If this kind of story moves your heart, do not forget to subscribe. This is not just a story, it is a mirror of the world we live in. Nobody noticed her at first. She sat quietly on the cold wooden bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes down, lips still. Her name was Mrs. Celia Grant, a widow in her late 60s who had worked as a cafeteria helper for most of her life. That morning, she had come to court not for herself, but to support her neighbor's son, a boy she had once watched grow up from her porch steps. He had been accused of something he did not do, and though she had no legal standing, she wanted to show up and sit behind him, like a mother would. She wore a simple blue dress, faded at the edges. But what caught everyone's eye, especially the guard posted near the jury box, was the small, shiny American flag pin on the left side of her chest. It was not loud, it was not large, but it glinted under the courtroom lights like it was made of something heavier than metal. When the guard asked her to remove it, she smiled kindly and said, "This is for my husband. He's served." The bailiff leaned in, whispered something to the judge. The judge paused, frowned. A minute later, 2 guards approached her with cold precision and told her to stand. Confused, she obeyed. Then they reached for her arms. "What is going on?" she asked, voice trembling, her pin still shining. "You are violating court decorum," the guard replied, without looking her in the eye. Before anyone in the room could fully grasp what was happening, Celia was being escorted out, dragged slowly past rows of people who had no idea what she had done wrong. And not a single person stood up for her. What happened outside that courtroom would ignite something that could not be undone. But no one knew it yet. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than it should have. Celia did not cry. She did not argue. She stood quietly near the steps, her hands gently touching the spot where the pin had been, now confiscated by a guard with no explanation. A reporter who had come to cover another case noticed the small commotion and approached her. "Ma'am, why were you escorted out?" he asked, lowering his mic out of respect. She looked at him with tired eyes and simply said, "They did not like my pin. They said it disturbed the court." He blinked, confused. "You mean the American flag pin?" She nodded. "My husband died wearing that same flag on his shoulder in Iraq. I wore it today because I wanted to remind the boy inside that someone still believes in justice. But maybe I was wrong to think this place did too." The words were soft, but they struck like thunder. The young reporter, barely out of journalism school, felt a lump in his throat. He took a deep breath and said, "Do you mind if I ask more?" On camera. She looked away for a moment, then back at him. "If you think it will help him, then yes." The footage was brief. Just her voice, her story, her face. No fancy editing. No raised voices. But in it, there was something raw, something undeniable, something that made people stop whatever they were doing and listen. By evening, the video had been passed from hand to hand, from mothers to teachers, from veterans to school kids. And while Celia herself did not own a phone smart enough to see it, the entire country was beginning to talk. But the court? They remained silent. What Celia decided to do next would test the foundation of everything that courtroom claimed to stand for. The next morning, the courthouse parking lot looked the same: gray concrete, oil stains, cars lined in neat rows. But inside, something was different. The courtroom was full before the judge even entered. Quiet murmurs buzzed through the crowd like nervous electricity. Lawyers whispered. The bailiff paced. Then the doors opened. Celia Grant walked in. But this time, she was not alone. Behind her walked 2 men in uniform, both Marines, their medals visible on their crisp jackets. One of them carried something in his hand, a neatly folded American flag. Following them were 5 veterans in civilian clothes, each with a quiet seriousness etched into their faces. And behind them, neighbors, teachers, grocery clerks, firefighters, mothers, nurses. A slow, respectful march of people who had all seen the video. People who had decided that silence was no longer an option. Celia did not say a word. She walked to the same bench where she had sat before, placed her handbag beside her, and pinned the American flag back onto her chest. The same one they had removed. The same one they told her was not welcome. The courtroom fell completely still. A clerk rushed to the judge's chambers. The prosecutor adjusted his tie 3 times. Even the guard who had removed her the day before kept his eyes low. Then a quiet, commanding voice broke the silence. It was the Marine beside her. "Your Honor," he said as the judge finally entered, I served 20 years under that flag, and I will not stand by while someone like her is treated like a threat for honoring it." The judge looked at Celia, looked at the crowd, then looked down at his own lapel where no flag pin rested. The court had a choice to make, and this time everyone was watching. The judge cleared his throat, but even he could feel the weight in the room. What once had been just another morning docket now pulsed with something far more powerful, something uncomfortable and uncontainable. "I want to remind everyone," he began, carefully choosing his words, "this court has always upheld rules of decorum for the sake of neutrality and order. Symbols, political or otherwise, can distract from the proceedings." Celia raised her hand. Her voice, though calm, cut through the air. "So now the flag is political?" There was a pause. No one answered. "I did not speak yesterday," she continued, standing now. "But I am speaking today. My husband bled for that flag. I buried him with full honors. And now, I am being told that remembering him, silently, respectfully, is disorderly." The courtroom remained frozen. The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Grant, this court did not intend to insult your service or your loss. The rules are applied uniformly." "Uniformly?" interrupted the Marine beside her. "My daughter wore a sports team pin in this same courtroom last month." No one said a word. A murmur spread across the room. Someone in the back whispered, "He is right. I saw it too." The contradiction was exposed. And once the cracks showed, they spread fast. The prosecutor, sensing the change in tone, attempted to redirect. "We should focus on the case before us. This is a court of law, not a public forum." But Celia would not let it drop. Justice without conscience is not justice. If this courtroom cannot see the difference between hate and honor, then maybe it is not the flag that needs to be removed. That line, those exact words, seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. The judge looked out at the crowd, and for the first time in years, he looked unsure. He realized that what stood before him was not just an old woman with a pin. It was the question of whether dignity had a place in justice. And behind those courtroom doors, the world was already reacting. But inside, the court still had not made its move. What happened next would not just decide Celia's right to wear a flag. It would test whether the system had the courage to face itself. The court recessed for an hour. But in that hour, something irreversible happened. Outside the building, a quiet crowd began to form. Veterans, teachers, high school students, families, all standing under the same flag Celia wore on her chest. No one shouted. No one held signs. They just stood, arms folded, eyes locked on the courthouse door. Silent, like Celia had been. But this silence was louder than words. Inside, pressure mounted. The court's administration, desperate to regain control, made a bold move. They issued an official statement declaring that personal symbols, including national flags, must be restricted to preserve courtroom neutrality. They did not mention Celia by name, but everyone knew who the statement was about. And that was their mistake, because it was no longer just about her. When the judge returned, he found the courtroom more packed than before. Word had spread fast. The boy Celia came to support, her neighbor, sat with wide eyes as he watched all of it unfold. He whispered to his public defender, "Why are they treating her like the problem?" Before the judge could speak, a woman stood up from the second row. She was black, middle-aged, and wore a nurse's uniform. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan," she said firmly. "He never got to come home. But that pin? That is how we keep him with us. And if that is a disruption to this court, then maybe this court needs to ask what it really stands for." Another man stood. A teacher, then a teenager, then a woman who had never met Celia but felt like she knew her. The judge banged his gavel once, twice, "Order in the court," he barked. But it was too late for that. Order had already shifted. The courtroom, once ruled by silence and fear, now pulsed with something else, conviction. Celia did not stand this time. She remained seated, her pin shining. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was already happening with or without her. And then, in the corner of the courtroom, a moment unfolded that would haunt the court forever. A young court officer reached into his coat pocket and quietly pinned a flag onto his own chest. No words, just a gesture. And with that, the walls of silence began to fall. By midday, the courthouse was no longer just a building. It was the center of a growing storm. News vans lined the streets. Reporters jostled for position, pressing microphones against glass, trying to get a glimpse of what was unfolding inside. But the real story was not in the soundbites. It was in the silence of a woman who had been pushed too far, and the people who finally decided to stand with her. Inside the court, Tension rippled like a low hum beneath every word. The judge ordered a brief recess to address what he called growing disruptions. But behind that careful language, the truth was boiling over. The court's own clerks whispered about it in corners. Files had been leaked. A court aide, unnamed and afraid, had passed a copy of an internal memo to a local journalist. The memo revealed that the court had quietly begun flagging visual symbols that may trigger bias, including pins, headscarves, and even Black Lives Matter wristbands. The memo was dated 6 months ago, and it had never been made public. Now it was. The news spread like sparks in dry grass. People who once kept their heads down began to lift them. Mothers whose children were scolded for braiding their hair a certain way in school. Workers who had been told not to look too political. Veterans who wore the flag until it no longer felt welcome in the places it was supposed to protect. The courtroom, once a symbol of law, was now a battleground of meaning. Back inside, the judge was handed a printed version of the leaked memo. His face froze. He glanced toward the media row, where cameras were now allowed to record, under public pressure. Celia sat still, hands folded. She did not smile. She did not gloat. But her eyes said everything. You tried to silence me. And now the whole world is listening. The prosecutor requested the court reconvene quickly. We need to restore order, he said. But order, as it turned out, was no longer theirs to define. And just as the judge began to speak again, a new voice rang out from the back. I would like to testify, it said. Deep, steady, commanding. Every head turned. It was the boy Celia came to support, now standing, trembling, but brave. What he was about to say would turn everything upside down. The room fell into a strange, breathless quiet. The kind that comes before lightning strikes. The boy stood tall, though his hands shook slightly. His name was Andre Morris. 17. Soft-spoken. Until now, he had been nothing more than a file number in a system that labeled him a suspect. But now, with the entire courtroom watching, he stepped forward, not as a defendant, but as a witness. I want to say something, he repeated, looking directly at the judge. Because I know what this court is really trying to hide. The prosecutor immediately objected, but the judge, under pressure and fully aware that every camera was rolling, allowed him to speak briefly. Andre looked down, took a breath, then raised his eyes. 2 months ago, I was arrested for a theft I did not commit. They said I stole a laptop from a school. But what no one wants to talk about is what really happened. The security footage shows someone else. A white student. Same age. But the officer who came said, and I quote, "These types of kids always lie. He meant me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Andre continued, his voice gaining strength. They said the footage was too blurry. But the other boy was never questioned. Not once. And the day before my court hearing, my public defender was told to just get a plea deal, because, in their words, this will not look good for us if it goes to trial. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Andre turned to the audience. I did not even want to speak today. I was scared. I thought, maybe they are right. Maybe people like me are easier to forget. But then Mrs. Grant came. And when they dragged her out for wearing the flag that covered my uncle's casket, something inside me snapped. I knew they would do anything to silence truth. So today, I am choosing not to be silent. The judge stared ahead, expressionless, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the bench. Andre added one last thing. If a flag is disruptive, and if an old woman's kindness is dangerous, then maybe the real threat is not what we wear. Maybe it is what we are willing to ignore. The courtroom was silent again. But it was not fear. It was something else. It was realization. And in that moment, Celia reached out and gently placed her hand on Andre's. She did not need to speak. Neither did he. But the system? It had just been exposed. And there would be no going back. The judge called for another recess, but no one moved. Not the crowd. Not Celia. Not Andre. Everyone stayed seated, as if the air had turned thick with truth and no one dared to disturb it. Behind closed doors, panic brewed. The memo leak. The boy's testimony. The flag pin. Each thread, on its own, could have been buried. But together, they formed a storm the court could no longer outrun. Down the hall, a young clerk, no older than Andre, stood outside the judge's chambers, listening to the chaos inside. He had joined the system hoping to make a difference. But what he had seen over the past year made that hope fade. Now, something inside him stirred again. A line had been crossed, and he knew what he had to do. He returned to his desk, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were internal emails, messages between the judge and prosecution, showing coordinated pressure to push cases involving repeat faces through the system quickly. In those emails, repeat faces meant one thing: black and brown youth. He walked quietly into the courtroom. He did not ask permission. He simply handed the envelope to the media table. One reporter opened it, read a few lines, and gasped. It was all there. Proof of profiling, targeting, silencing. Months of it. The news spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed. Reporters stood and left to call their editors. Outside, the crowd doubled in size. Inside, the judge finally returned, this time without his robe. He looked older, smaller, stripped of the confidence he had worn so easily just hours ago. He stood behind the bench but did not sit. This court, he began slowly, has made errors. Some of them, grave. Celia tilted her head slightly, watching. The judge continued, effective immediately. The charges against Mr. Morris are dropped. The incident regarding Mrs. Grant will be formally apologized for in writing and in public. The courtroom held its breath. In this court, he added, voice cracking slightly, will undergo full review and audit, starting today. A pause. Because justice should not be selective. He stepped away from the bench, and in a move no one expected, he removed the badge from his chest, set it down, and walked out of the room. There was no applause, only stillness. Heavy, meaningful stillness. Celia looked at Andre. Andre looked at her. For once, the system had listened. The story exploded across the country. News outlets ran headlines like "Judge resigns amid flag pin scandal" and "Teens Truth exposes systemic bias in court." But what caught the nation's attention most was the quiet dignity of the woman at the center of it all. Celia Grant. Until now, she had been invisible to most. Just a kind neighbor. A soft-spoken widow. But as reporters dug deeper into who she was, they uncovered something that changed the narrative completely. Decades ago, in her 20s, Celia had been one of the first black women accepted into a prestigious Southern law school. But she never graduated. Why? Because she left her studies to care for her mother, who was terminally ill. And after that, she could not afford to return. Instead of arguing cases in court, she cleaned the halls of one. Reporters found an old newspaper clipping, a photograph of young Celia holding a legal textbook, her eyes full of fire, captioned, Celia Grant, one of the few. Suddenly, people began to understand. The calm she carried, the questions she asked in court, the reason she showed up that day. It was never just about a pin. It was about something she had carried her whole life. The belief that justice should never belong to a few. A former professor, now retired, saw the story and reached out to a journalist. He recalled Celia's brilliance, her ability to argue complex cases with compassion and clarity. If she had stayed in law, he said, we might have had a judge who never needed reminding what justice really looks like. And that quote, that single sentence, went viral across television, social media, and newsrooms. It sparked petitions. One petition demanded Celia be awarded an honorary law degree. Another asked that the court building be renamed in her honor. But Celia, sitting on her porch in her quiet neighborhood, only smiled when she was told. I did not need a robe to know what was right, she said softly. I only needed to speak. And somewhere, not far from her, Andre sat with a college application form open in front of him. Under intended major, he wrote just one word. Law. Weeks passed. The court was no longer the same, and neither was the town. The flag pin that once sparked outrage now rested in a glass case near the courthouse entrance, placed there with a plaque that read, in honor of Celia Grant, proof that justice begins with courage. Students came to visit it. Veterans paused in front of it. Judges walked by it each morning, reminded of a moment they almost missed, but never will again. Andre, once treated like a suspect, now walked taller. He had been accepted into a university with a full scholarship, granted not for his silence, but for his voice. He wrote essays about Celia, about dignity, about systems built to be questioned. And everywhere he went, he wore a small pin on his chest, not because it made him feel powerful, but because it reminded him of the woman who showed him what power really looked like. As for Celia, she returned to her life with quiet grace. She still sat on her porch in the evenings, still smiled at neighbors walking by. But something had changed. Not in her, but in everyone around her. People listened differently now. And all it took was one woman, standing up, when no one else would. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions do not begin with anger or noise. They begin with a simple act of refusing to be invisible. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that silence is never neutral, then do not leave without subscribing. Because stories like this matter, and voices like Celia's deserve to be heard everywhere. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never be afraid to stand for what is right.